Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. This is the first proper episode in the series Decolonising the Music Curriculum. If you haven't watched my introduction, please watch that first. It provides lots of the backgrounds for why we would want to try to decolonise any curriculum, etc. In this video, I'm going to be looking at two very different composers. One of them, Frederick Handel, one of the most famous composers of his era. His music is still played and celebrated all over the world, and rightly so. No one's arguing that anyone should stop listening to Handel. Again, watch the introduction video. The second composer is Ignatius Sancho, someone who's a little less well known, but he lived in London around the same time as Handel, was one of the first successful European composers of African heritage, etc. What links the two of them, I hear you ask? Why, the slave trade. In this talk, my first go proposing one aspect of what a decolonised music curriculum could look like, we're talking about Handel and the slave trade, and how Ignatius Sancho suffered as an indirect result. Let's get into it.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of musicology.
Frederick Handel, composer of instrumental music like the Water Music, oratorios like The Messiah, keyboard works like The Harmonious Blacksmith, and so much more besides. Handel was born in Halle, Germany, and had spells working as a composer in Hamburg and in Italy, but he settled in London in 1712 and essentially stayed there for the rest of his life. He became a full British citizen in 1727. His music combined the tradition of German polyphony with the dramatic flair of Italian opera, and this proved irresistible for English audiences. Like every composer in the 18th century, Handel was a shrewd businessman, knowing which aristocratic patrons to flatter, and who would like particular pieces, and even as far as knowing which musical styles would suit different opera audiences. Handel wrote over 40 operas, and to support these works, he started no fewer than 3 different opera companies in London. But opera was a risky venture, and any work that was a serious flop could bankrupt any opera company. With such risks, Handel would eventually abandon the genre after having a breakdown, or a stroke, nobody's quite sure which, and after 1741 he would only write oratorios and instrumental music. He died 1759, a rich and respected man, with a state funeral in Westminster Abbey. To protect his risky opera productions, Handel did as much as he could to invest money, to have what we would now call a portfolio of investments. Here enters the darker side of this story. If you know anything about 18th century British history, you'll know that just about any profitable industry at this time will eventually link back to the slave trade. In the late 1710s, Handel was in the direct employ of the Duke of Chandos, James Bridges. From 1717 to 1719, Handel was the house composer for Canons, the Duke's stately home. The Duke's fortune was primarily made by his work in stock companies, most notably the South Sea Company. This company was formed to consolidate other debts, but was also granted the exclusive rights to sell African slaves to colonies in South America. Straight away, this is the context in which Handel was working in. It's difficult to find any very rich person in 18th century Britain who didn't have links to the slave trade. But Handel's links go a lot further. Thanks to musicologist David Hunter's fantastic work, we now know that Handel was himself a direct investor in the slave trade, perhaps made through the Duke's influence or at his suggestion. Hunter had found Handel's name mentioned in a document that listed the adventurers, that is, the investors, of the Royal African Company in 1720. The Royal African Company had, by that point, the exclusive rights in the slave trade around the Caribbean and South America. That is, they operated slave ships that seized peoples from their home, shipped people over the Atlantic Ocean in brutal conditions, and then sold them into a life of servitude and misery. And Handel invested in it. £600 to be exact. That's a substantial sum of money, probably worth over £100,000 today. But the profitability of these shares was not great. Handel doesn't seem to have made any serious return on them, and as Hunter writes, "In the context of financial capitalism, the profitability of stock trades is the prime measure of success, and as we know, Handel has been praised for his ability to amass a fortune. But profitability is not, of course, the only criterion that can be applied when choosing a stock. Instead, we can see that Handel invested in this company principally because lots of his friends and his other patrons did too. We can see that just about any rich investor at this time also held interests in the Royal African Company. One of the opera companies that Handel founded, the Royal Academy of Music, not to be confused with the famous conservatoire of the same name. That company had many members who were also on the Royal African Company Book of Investors, just under 1/3 of them, in fact. It's a fact of 18th century British economics. The majority of wealthy people either had links to or invested in the slave trade. In terms of music, many of those same people then invested in the arts and subscribed to or directly financed music and composers. To talk about the economics of 18th century music in Britain is an enormous overlap with the economics of the 18th century slave trade. Hunter writes, "It has become clearer with each new piece of research just how integral to and enmeshed with the slave economy was the broader economy of Britain. We know that some direct participants in the slave economy used their profits to amass art collections, build grand houses, refashion landscapes, and support opera. Now we can see that musical activity was funded in part by slavery's profits." Even further than this, Hunter has since written how other manuscripts and works by Handel were supported by wealthy patrons who benefited from the slave trade. Even a treasured work like The Messiah, Handel's original performing score, is today held like a sacred treasure in the Bodleian Library of Oxford. The less explored story of how it was preserved for the world is, again, a story of the slave trade, tracing the profits and money of the Otley family. Another large collection of Handel's manuscripts held in the British Library was amassed by the Granville family, another large investor in the Royal African Company. Hunter concludes with chilling accuracy. The artefacts of slavery are not only the manacles, branding irons and whips, or the slaves' own possessions, but also the scores and musical instruments funded by slavery's profits. But what's some contrasting context that I could offer to give further detail or insight on Handel's investments and this whole sorry story of 18th century music? Enter my second composer of focus, Ignatius Sancho. Ignatius Sancho was, by all accounts, an extraordinary person. His friend William Stevenson wrote in his obituary that Sancho had seen more of human life in all its varieties, from the prince to the beggar, and no one ever made a better use than he did of the knowledge resulting from his observations. Sancho underwent a difficult journey. He was born in 1729 on board a slave ship during the Middle Passage. That is, on a ship that had forcibly taken African people, including Sancho's mother and father, where licensed slave traders forced them to endure the most cruel conditions imaginable. On average, 25% of people did not survive the crossing. Sancho was born in these conditions. He and his family were taken to the Spanish colony of New Granada, modern-day Colombia, which had trading links with the Royal African Company, the same company that Handel had shares in. Handel helped finance the company that exerted this cruelty. Sancho was baptised with the name Ignatius, but later assumed Charles, even though he is now better known by the name Ignatius. His mother died shortly after arriving in New Granada, and his father committed suicide rather than endure the horrors of slavery. When he was barely 2 years old, his master took him to England and gave him to 3 sisters who lived in Greenwich, London. They thought that keeping the child ignorant would make him submissive. Those 3 sisters gave him the surname Sancho, after Don Quixote's long-suffering squire and assistant. The Duke of Montague was a neighbour, and he took an interest in Sancho's education. When the Duke died in 1749, Sancho fled from his mistress's house and sought protection from the Duke's widow. She granted this and gave him a comfortable job as a butler in her household. but after her death in 1751, he ended up in service to her son-in-law, this time as valet. He was painted by Gainsborough in this striking portrait, looking refined. By 1774, he was too ill with gout, that is, a rich person's disease, to continue service, and then he opened up his own shop in Westminster in 1774. Sancho was extremely well educated by this point, fluent in French and other languages. He published several compositions, and also a treatise on the theory of music, dedicated to the Princess Royal, now lost. As an intellectual and pioneer, Sancho holds the status of numerous firsts. The first African person to vote in a European election, the first known published African playwright. When he died in 1780, his friends banded together to have his letters published. They're written in a humorous tone, taking style and influence from his beloved Lawrence Sterne, author of Tristram Shandy, and he was a personal friend. The legacy of these letters was used in the nascent abolitionist movement that was then beginning to take hold in England in the late 18th century. So there you have it, Ignatius Sancho, a pioneer and celebrated intellectual. His suffering was arguably funded by Handel's initial investments, though. We know that Sancho held Handel's music in the highest possible regard. The only surviving manuscripts from Sancho's letters mourn a lost friend, and he describes how they have gone to heaven, surrounded by the great artists. In prime of years, in the meridian of character as an artist, and universally esteemed as a man, he winged his rapid flight to those celestial mansions where Pope, Hogarth, Handel, Chatham, and Garrick are enjoying the full sweets of beatific vision with the great artists. Here is a photograph from that manuscript, a poignant image where someone who arguably suffered from a line that could be traced directly back to Handel here celebrates his music and legacy. Sancho provides something of a counterweight to the knowledge of Handel's involvement in the slave trade. But was Handel naive? Can we forgive him for being ignorant? The abolitionist movement in the early 1700s was almost non-existent, but there were voices. The same Duke of Montague who supported the young Sancho also helped free other slaves, including Job ben Solomon, who he helped to return to Africa. Thomas Blewett published an account of Solomon's life and alluded to the horrors of slavery, published in 1734. In other words, there were contemporaries who were calling out the horrors and inhumanity of the slave trade. It's not enough to say that Handel was just unaware. But at the same time, there were very few voices speaking out. As David Olusoga writes, to fully understand how remarkable the rise of British abolitionism was, both as a political movement and as a popular sentiment, it is important to remember how few voices were raised against slavery in Britain until the last quarter of the 18th century. So where does this all leave us then? From a decolonisation perspective, we can see how we have gained lots of new views and information. We see the complex web of 18th century British economics and how much of it involved the slave trade. How a composer as respected as Handel could be a direct investor in this trade, and how composers like Sancho were directly affected. We should hear more of Sancho's music performed, but I'm not arguing that we should hear any less of Handel's. Messiah is one of the most widely performed choral works, especially at Christmas and Easter time. An understanding of Handel's links to the slave trade gives us more history, gives us more understanding. It's an uncomfortable fact, but so much music from this time period was supported by the profits of the slave trade. Should we stop listening to this music? In my view, no, but the least we should do is to talk about this fact. We can only ever learn more by doing this. From a decolonisation perspective, we acknowledge this injustice, we recognise the historical situation, and we perhaps then move to consider just how to frame this kind of history in our present era. Okay, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tell your friends. Like, subscribe, etc. Also, you might like to watch my video on genius, another word frequently used to describe Handel. Okay, thanks, bye.